At just 12 years old, Marcus shoulders the weight of his family's survival. With a father gone and a mother working long hours, Marcus becomes the silent protector of his siblings. But one fateful knock on the door threatens to change everything. His father's absence has left a void, but Marcus isn't about to let his family fall apart. As he fixes broken machines, cares for his younger siblings, and fights exhaustion, he finds himself at a crossroads. Will he continue to carry the weight alone, or will something finally give? But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Marcus had always been the man of the house. At just 12 years old, his shoulders were heavy with the weight of responsibility that no child should bear. He lived in a small, weathered house in the middle of Georgia, where the air smelled of dust and struggle. His mother, Sarah, worked long hours at a local diner just to scrape by, leaving him to watch over his two younger siblings, Tommy and Lisa. Their father? He'd vanished months ago, leaving nothing but an empty chair at the dinner table and a hole in their hearts. Despite the absence of their father, Marcus never complained. He couldn't afford to. He'd learned that early on when Sarah had to take on double shifts just to keep the lights on and food on the table. The house, though small and worn, was still a place where he tried to make it feel like home. Every day he found himself doing things no boy his age should. Fixing broken appliances, patching up leaky pipes, and even making sure Tommy's shoes were in one piece before he went off to school. "Marcus, can you fix my shoe?" Tommy's voice interrupted his thoughts as he worked on the old washing machine that hadn't been cooperating for days. Tommy stood there, holding his tattered sneaker in one hand, his other clutching his backpack. Marcus barely glanced up, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Hold still for 5 minutes. Let it dry properly this time. I don't have time to fix it again tomorrow." Tommy grumbled, but Marcus could see his younger brother's eyes shine with admiration. Marcus was the one person Tommy could rely on, even if their world had crumbled down around them. He could never make Tommy understand how much it tore him up, but he tried. Sarah came out of the kitchen, her purse slung over her shoulder, ready for another exhausting day at the diner. The constant grind had worn her down, but she had no choice. The bills never stopped coming, and the pantry always seemed to be empty before paychecks arrived. She smiled faintly at Marcus, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion that lurked beneath her calm demeanor. "You're a good boy, Marcus," she whispered, walking toward the door. "Make sure you look after your brother and sister." Her words, soft as they were, carried a weight that lingered in the air long after she left. She didn't have to say much, but he could feel it, the pressure, the silent plea for him to hold things together. And he did. Every single day. But today something was different. The weight of everything, the constant strain, the worry about how they'd get by without a father figure, the silence of a home that once had laughter, was about to push Marcus over the edge. The house groaned under the strain, its walls creaking like a ship caught in a storm. The smell of rusted metal from the old pipes filled the air, and the heat in the kitchen felt stifling. He could hear Tommy and Lisa bickering in the other room, their voices sharp against the backdrop of silence. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. And it wasn't just the house that felt fragile. It was Marcus himself. He was barely holding on. Every day felt like a battle, every task a mountain he had to climb. And yet, he couldn't stop. He couldn't allow himself to break, not when his family depended on him. But as he looked down at the shoe he was trying to fix for Tommy, his fingers trembled. Something was about to change. The quiet that had enveloped their home for so long was about to be shattered. Marcus could feel it, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. He didn't know what would come next, but deep down, he knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. As Tommy complained about the shoe, Marcus set it down, his heart racing. There was a sudden, deafening knock on the front door. It wasn't the usual sound of a delivery or a neighbor stopping by. It was firm, urgent, like a warning. Marcus felt a jolt of fear ripple through him. His stomach twisted as he stood, his body stiffening. He shot a quick glance at Tommy and Lisa, who had fallen silent. They knew something was wrong too. With a glance toward the door, Marcus moved toward it slowly, his mind racing. Whoever was on the other side had come to change everything. He could feel it in his bones. His hand gripped the doorknob, and as the doors swung open, the world outside rushed in, leaving him no time to prepare for what was coming next. Marcus?" The voice came from the figure standing at the doorstep, and for a moment, Marcus couldn't even speak. He could barely breathe. Everything he thought he knew, every routine, every expectation shattered in an instant. And the storm began. Marcus's legs burned as he walked home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight of the day still heavy on him. His mind wasn't focused on the lessons he had just learned, or the quiet lunchroom where he sat unnoticed. No, his thoughts were elsewhere, on the machine that had caught his eyes. He walked past Andrew's farm earlier that day. The tractor, a rusted heap of broken parts that sat idle in the middle of the field, looking like a forgotten relic. Marcus had spent a lot of time on that farm as a child, hanging out with his father when things were simpler. He could still hear his dad's voice, the deep drawl of his southern accent, talking about machines, their guts and gears, the way everything worked together like a puzzle. "You've got to understand the way things tick, son. Machines, not just metal, they're alive in a way. Every part has a job. If you take the time to listen, they'll tell you what's wrong." Marcus had spent hours on the tractor, feeling the rattle of the engine and watching the way the gears clicked into place. He remembered how his father had shown him how to fix the little things. Tighten this bolt, adjust that lever. It was his first taste of independence, of doing something real. Now it seemed like those lessons, though long gone, were more than just memories. They were a lifeline. And today, as he walked past that broken tractor, the memory of his father's lessons surged through him. He stopped and studied it. There it was, exactly what his father would have noticed. The timing belt, misaligned, stretched out like a worn rubber band. He could almost feel it in his hands, the way the mechanics worked together, how it all clicked. Without thinking, Marcus approached the tractor, his steps sure and steady. He hadn't thought much about fixing something like this in a long time. After all, he was just a kid. But as he reached for the tractor's worn-out engine, he could almost hear his dad's voice urging him on. The sun was sinking lower in the sky when Marcus finally arrived at the farm after school. His mother's warning to be home before dark echoed in his mind, but today something was different. Today he wasn't just some boy with a chipped pencil and dirty shoes. Today he was a problem solver. The barn doors were slightly ajar, and Marcus could see Mr. Andrews, the farm's owner, standing next to the tractor. The man's brow was furrowed in frustration, his hands covered in grease as he worked at the engine. The other farm hands scattered around the area shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how the thing hadn't run in weeks. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then walked up to the older man. "Mr. Andrews," he called, his voice a little unsure but determined. "I think I can help." The older man didn't look up right away, too engrossed in the stubborn parts of the tractor. "Help? Mr. Andrews grumbled, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes were skeptical. "You sure about that, boy? This ain't no school project." Marcus straightened up, trying to keep his voice steady. I've seen something like this before. It might be the timing belt. It's out of alignment." Mr. Andrews scoffed, wiping his hands on his ragged shirt. "A kid knows about timing belts now, huh?" he asked, looking Marcus up and down, clearly doubtful. "All right, show me what you're talking about. Can't make it worse than it already is." The farmhands laughed quietly among themselves, exchanging looks. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the machine, his fingers brushing over the rough surface of the engine. It wasn't easy. He had to work with what little tools he could find, his hands moving with precision, memories of his father's steady instructions guiding him. As he adjusted the belt, the other farmhands watched, their amusement fading into silence. Marcus was too focused to care about them. He tightened the belt with a few quick twists, pulling the parts together just right. Then, with a sharp breath, he reached for the ignition. "Let's see what happens," he muttered under his breath. When Marcus turned the key, the engine sputtered, then roared to life. A soft hum filled the air, a steady, almost comforting rhythm as the tractor came back to life. It was like a small victory, a moment when the world shifted, when Marcus was no longer just a kid in the shadows, but someone who could do something. He looked up at Mr. Andrews, his chest swelling with pride. Mr. Andrews blinked, then let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "That's one hell of a job for a boy your age." Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans, trying not to smile too widely. "Just did what I could," he said simply, his voice steady, though his heart raced in his chest. The other farmhands were silent now, their eyes wide with surprise. Marcus felt the heat of their stares, but this time it wasn't with mockery. It was respect. He had done something. He had fixed something real, something that had been broken for far too long. Mr. Andrews stepped forward and slapped Marcus on the back with a grin. "You did good work today, boy. Real good work." Marcus stood taller, the praise sinking into him like warm sunlight. It wasn't just about the tractor. It was about what this moment meant. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he had a purpose, like he could carry some weight for his family, even if it was just a small part of the bigger picture. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the farm, Marcus stayed by the tractor, staring at the machine as it hummed steadily. He felt something shift inside him, a confidence that had been buried beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. Maybe he didn't have a father to teach him the ropes, but he had something else. Something that ran deeper than blood or name. He had knowledge, skill, and the drive to make things right. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone who could fix things, who could help, who could stand tall in the face of whatever came next. And as the evening air grew cool, Marcus felt a sense of belonging. Not in the way he had imagined, not in the place of a perfect family, but in the way that mattered. He had done something. And for now, that was enough. The farmhands finally broke the silence, murmuring to each other in low tones, impressed by the unexpected turn of events. As Marcus walked back toward the edge of the field, the sound of the tractor still rumbling behind him, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't alone in this. There were people who saw him, people who were beginning to believe in what he could do. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still so many battles to fight, so many days when the weight of the world would press down on his shoulders again. But for tonight, as the stars began to light up the sky and the hum of the tractor echoed in his ears, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. The storm had passed, but he could feel the next one building on the horizon. And this time, he would face it head-on. Marcus stood in the barn, sweat soaking his shirt, his hands covered in dirt and grease, his muscles aching from a day that seemed to stretch on forever. The low hum of the machines around him was a constant reminder of the work he had to do. The farm was in disrepair. Broken down tractors, leaky irrigation systems, neglected fences, and Marcus had quickly learned that maintaining the equipment was only the beginning. He had to keep the farm running, make sure it survived. He couldn't afford to fail. When Mr. Andrews had offered him the part-time job, Marcus had been unsure. The relief was undeniable. Money for his family, a steady role in the world outside his home. But it came with consequences. As the sun dipped low each evening, the toll of the work began to show. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was the weight of responsibility. Marcus had learned that quickly, the first few weeks of labor pushing him to the edge. His grades slipped. His teachers noticed the tiredness in his eyes, the times he couldn't focus, the assignments he didn't turn in. He fought to keep it all together, the farm and his schoolwork, but there were nights when he couldn't find the strength to do anything more than collapse into bed, only to rise the next morning and do it all over again. Then there was Jake. Jake had been one of the first farmhands Marcus had encountered when he started working there. He was older, rough around the edges, and didn't take kindly to the young boy's presence. From the start, there was an undercurrent of resentment between them. Jake had been working at the farm for years, and the idea of a 12-year-old showing up and doing his job didn't sit right with him. "You're just a kid," Jake muttered one afternoon when Marcus had finished repairing a pump. "Ain't got all day, little man. Some of us got real work to do." Marcus had bitten his lip, the anger bubbling up inside him, but he swallowed it down. There was no room for that here. Jake didn't understand. None of them did. How much this meant to him, how much he had to prove. But Marcus had learned to bite his tongue and do the work, to let his hands show what his mouth couldn't. It was the only way to survive here. That night, after a long day of work, Marcus collapsed onto the worn-out couch at home. Tommy and Lisa were sitting on the floor, playing with a broken toy, and for a moment, Marcus just watched them. They were his reason for pushing through, for surviving. He had to make sure they had a future, one that didn't look like his own. "Marcus," Tommy said, glancing up at him, "can you teach me how to play baseball? We can learn together." The question caught him off guard. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wanted to say yes, wanted to be the big brother, the one who showed Tommy how to throw the perfect pitch, how to swing a bat and hit a ball. But he was too tired. His body was screaming for rest, and the thought of squeezing in a baseball lesson on top of everything else seemed impossible. But Marcus knew that Tommy didn't ask for much. He never did. The boy just wanted to feel like he had something to hold on to, something to look forward to. And Marcus was all he had. "Yeah," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "We'll learn together. Soon, okay?" The weight of the promise sat heavily on his chest as he lay back, staring at the ceiling. He had to keep going. For Tommy, for Lisa, for the life they could have if he could just make it through. But that night, when the darkness settled in and the house fell silent, Marcus knew something had to give. He couldn't keep up this pace. He couldn't balance school, work, and taking care of his family without breaking. The next day, he woke up early, the sky still dark, his alarm clock blaring in his ear. His body screamed at him to sleep, just a few more minutes, but he forced himself out of bed. He had to make sure the cows were fed, the equipment was ready, and that everything was in working order. Jake's voice echoed in his mind, a harsh reminder of what he was up against. Some of us got real work to do. The farm was a battlefield, and Marcus was caught in the middle, trying to make a life for himself and his siblings while facing the harsh reality of a world that didn't care about the weight on his shoulders. As he worked alongside Pete, the seasoned mechanic who had been on the farm for years, he learned the value of silence in the midst of hard work. Pete had been around long enough to know how to fix just about anything, and he became Marcus's quiet mentor. Pete's hands moved quickly, efficiently, as he showed Marcus the tricks of the trade. There was no rush with Pete, no impatience like Jake had. Pete was steady like the old farm machines, running smoothly even when the work was tough. "You'll get the hang of it, kid," Pete said one afternoon, wiping his hands on his jeans after showing Marcus how to properly align a tractor's engine. "You've got good instincts. Keep at it." Marcus nodded, trying to absorb everything Pete had taught him. But as the days wore on, he felt the strain beginning to show. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, his stomach constantly growling from lack of sleep. He tried to hide it from his siblings, but Tommy noticed. He always noticed. "Marcus, are you okay?" Tommy asked one evening as Marcus struggled to keep his eyes open while fixing a busted pipe. Marcus shot him a tired smile, trying to push away the creeping doubt that was gnawing at him. "I'm fine, Tommy. Just tired. Go to bed." Tommy didn't argue. He never did, but Marcus could see the worry in his younger brother's eyes, and it only made the weight on his shoulders feel heavier. The tension between Marcus and Jake grew with each passing day. Jake never missed an opportunity to remind Marcus that he wasn't cut out for farm life. He'd make snide comments under his breath, calling Marcus just a kid, or too soft to handle real work. The worst part was that in some moments, Marcus found himself starting to believe it. One afternoon, as Marcus was working on the tractor, trying to fix a stubborn part, Jake stepped up beside him, his boots heavy against the dirt floor. "You think you're something special, huh?" Jake spat, crossing his arms. "You're not. You're just a kid, trying to play grown-up. This is real work. This is where the real men are." Marcus gritted his teeth, the insult cutting deep, but he couldn't let Jake see how much it hurt. He had to keep going, had to show Jake and everyone else that he wasn't just a kid. He was a man in the making, a man who had to fix things. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside him. "I'm doing my job." Jake's lip curled into a sneer. "We'll see how long you last, little man. You'll quit like all the others." The words stung, but Marcus didn't let them get to him. He couldn't. Not now. Not when he was this close to earning his place. As the days dragged on, Marcus pushed himself harder, refusing to let the exhaustion take hold. He worked through the mornings, through the afternoons, through the nights. He barely had time to think about anything else. About his grades, about baseball with Tommy, about the future. All he could think about was survival. Then came the day when everything changed. The tractor he'd been working on for days broke down again, and this time, Marcus couldn't fix it. No matter how hard he tried, the engine refused to start. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. But when he called out for Pete, there was no response. No one came. Jake appeared, leaning against the barn door, a smug grin plastered on his face. "What's the matter, boy? Can't fix it now, can you?" Marcus turned to face him, frustration boiling over. "I've been trying. It's different this time, all right?" Jake's grin widened. "Guess you're not so great after all, huh?" In that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just him and Jake, to the heat of the barn, the sweat on his skin, the anger rising in his chest. He had worked so damn hard. He had tried over and over again, but nothing seemed to be enough. And then, with a quiet fury, Marcus made a decision. "You think I can't do it?" he said. his voice low but filled with resolve. "I'll show you." Jake's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he laughed, shaking his head. "You think you've got what it takes? You're just a kid, Marcus." But Marcus didn't listen. He turned back to the tractor, his hands moving with a speed and precision that surprised even him. He focused everything he had left, his anger, his frustration, his fear, into fixing it. He refused to let Jake or anyone else tell him he wasn't good enough. Minutes stretched into hours, but Marcus didn't stop. His hands worked mechanically, methodically. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life. For a moment, the farm was silent. Then, Jake's laugh died in his throat. Marcus stood tall, sweat pouring down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he had done it. And in that moment, as Jake stood speechless, Marcus realized something. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He wasn't just trying to prove himself. He was a force to be reckoned with. Jake's face was pale as Marcus turned and walked away, leaving him standing there alone, as the tractor's engine hummed behind him. The sun was just beginning to rise over Andrew's farm, casting a golden hue across the rows of crops ready for harvest. The farm buzzed with the usual morning activity, workers starting their routines, cows mooing in the distance, and the hum of machinery breaking through the stillness. But today, there was an underlying tension in the air that no one could shake off. The harvest was always a high-stakes time for the farm, but today was different. Today, the farm's main harvester, the lifeblood of their operation, had broken down. The massive machine, the size of a small house, had been running all night, pushing the last stretch of work before the rains came. But as dawn broke, it ground to a halt in the middle of the field, its massive engine sputtering and coughing like an old man too tired to keep going. The workers gathered around, inspecting it from every angle. But no one could figure out the problem. The machine was essential, and if it couldn't be fixed in time, the harvest would be ruined, and so would the entire season's work. The farm's livelihood hung in the balance. Marcus had been pulling weeds from a distant field when the call came, a shout from one of the workers. "Marcus, get over here, quick!" He sprinted to the harvester, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he saw the growing circle of men, the worried expressions on their faces, and the grim look from Mr. Andrews. "Marcus," Mr. Andrews said, his voice laced with urgency, "the harvester's down and we don't have much time. You've worked with the equipment before. I think you can fix it?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew this was his moment. He had been here before, fixing what was broken, holding things together when no one else could. It was all he knew. He nodded without speaking, his mind already racing. His father's lessons echoed in his mind, the words that had shaped him into the young man he was now. If you're going to fix something, you need to see it as a whole. You can't just patch it. You need to make it work, even when you don't have the right parts. He crawled under the machine, his hands slick with oil, his eyes scanning the various components. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the pressure to succeed, the knowledge that failing was not an option. The men around him muttered, their voices a background hum that Marcus drowned out as he focused. Time was running out. Every second mattered. The first issue was simple enough. The fuel line had come loose. Marcus tightened it with quick, steady hands, his movements precise. The engine whined back to life for a moment, but then it stopped again. The problem was deeper than that. Something was seriously wrong. As Marcus began tearing apart the engine, Pete, the old mechanic who had been teaching him tricks, hovered nearby, watching closely. He didn't say much, but his gaze followed Marcus with a hint of respect. "I'll be damned," Pete muttered under his breath when Marcus tightened a loose bolt with a flick of his wrist. Kid's got hands like a seasoned mechanic. But just as Marcus was starting to feel like he was making progress, something unexpected happened. There was a loud snap, a sound that froze everyone in place. Marcus shot a glance at the secondary drive belt. It had snapped clean in half. Without that belt, the harvester wouldn't run. And there was no backup. The farm was at the mercy of time now. And that time was running out. Marcus felt the weight of the situation settle over him. He couldn't afford to panic. The harvester had to be fixed. It had to be. Like, if you find this video helpful, it helps me a lot. He looked around desperately. No spare parts. No secondary drive belts in sight. His mind raced, and then it clicked. Something his father had taught him. Something he hadn't fully understood until now. His father had always said that in tough situations, when there was no easy way out, you had to improvise, make do with what you had. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his eyes scanning the farmyard, searching for anything that could work. His gaze landed on an old rusted tractor, half buried in the weeds. It wasn't much, but it could be the answer. Without a word, Marcus sprinted toward the tractor, knowing he had no time to lose. The workers watched as he began to tear into it, removing the drive belt with the same urgency that had overtaken him. They didn't understand what he was doing, but Marcus didn't care. His father's words rang in his ears as he worked. You don't need fancy parts to get the job done. Sometimes you just have to make it work. Marcus pulled the old tractor belt free, inspecting it with careful eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough. He hurried back to the harvester, the tractor belt in his hands, and slid back under the machine. He quickly started to fit the makeshift belt into place, twisting it, adjusting it, forcing it to work. It wasn't easy. The belt didn't fit perfectly. There were gaps, moments when Marcus had to pause and adjust his approach, but slowly, painstakingly, he made it work. His hands were raw, his arms shaking with the effort, but he refused to stop. The pressure was unbearable, but Marcus didn't let it control him. He kept his focus, kept his hands steady, and finally, with one last twist, the belt was secure. He wiped his forehead, breathing heavily, and with a deep breath, he reached for the ignition, the moment of truth. He turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. His heart skipped a beat, and then, with a growl, the harvester's engine roared to life. The massive machine shuddered, and then, slowly, it hummed with the sound of a working engine. The entire farm seemed to hold its breath, and then it ran. Marcus couldn't believe it. The machine was running smoothly again, the engine purring like it was brand new. The farm workers around him erupted into cheers, the tension breaking, the weight lifting from Marcus's chest. He had done it. He had fixed the harvester. Mr. Andrews walked over to him, his face a mix of awe and pride. He slapped Marcus on the back, the rough hand strong and warm. You earned this today, Marcus. Mr. Andrews said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. One, to the workshop. You've proven yourself to me, to all of us. Marcus took the key, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the flood of relief and pride. It wasn't just a key. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. It was a symbol of the man he was becoming, of the responsibility he had embraced, of the trust he had earned. Pete stepped forward, giving Marcus a quick nod. Where'd you learn that trick, kid? Marcus, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline, looked up at Pete with a smile. My father taught me, sometimes you have to make things work with what you have. Pete gave him a long look, a nod of approval. Your father taught you well. The workers, who had been skeptical of Marcus at first, now looked at him with newfound respect. Even Jake, the hardest to impress, stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He walked up to Marcus, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Guess you really are good for something after all, huh?" Jake said, though there was no malice in his voice this time. Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "I told you I'd prove it." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the farm. The harvest was back on track, and the work would continue. But for Marcus, this moment was everything. It wasn't just about fixing a broken machine. It was about proving to himself and to the world that he had the strength to carry on, to face whatever challenge came his way. As the workers resumed their tasks, Marcus stood there for a moment, holding the key in his hand, feeling the weight of it. He had earned his place on the farm, earned the respect of the men who had once doubted him. And as the evening sky turned purple, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for now, as the harvest continued and the farm came back to life, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He was ready. Ready for whatever came next. And he would face it head on. The days following the harvest were a blur of motion, yet there was a stillness within Marcus, a sense of something settling in his chest. The weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter now, not because it was gone, but because he had learned to shoulder it with purpose. Every task, every hour spent on the farm had shaped him into something stronger than he had ever thought possible. But it wasn't just the farm that was changing, it was Marcus too. After fixing the harvester, Marcus had started to see himself differently. He no longer felt like a kid struggling to survive. He felt like a man standing tall in a world that didn't offer second chances. His mother noticed it first, the way he moved through the house now, the quiet confidence that replaced the tired hesitations of the boy who used to linger in the background. Marcus had always done his best to be the man his family needed, but now he could feel the change inside himself. He was excelling in school again, his grades improving as his mind, once distracted by the constant need to work, focused on learning. Mrs. Carter, his English teacher, had commented on his recent essays, praising his growing ability to articulate thoughts clearly. The words came easier now, a reflection of how much he had grown. And then, when the high school counselor, Mr. Delgado, approached him with a proposal he hadn't expected, Marcus realized that the doors to his future were opening wide. "Marcus," Mr. Delgado said one afternoon, pulling him aside after class, "you've been working harder than anyone I've seen in a long time. You've got real potential. How would you like to apply for early admission to the engineering program at the State University?" The words hit Marcus like a jolt of electricity. A scholarship? A program that could change everything for him? He hadn't allowed himself to dream like that before, not while the struggle of each day loomed larger than the future. But now, it felt real. He could see it. He could feel it. "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "It's a lot to think about." "You've already been thinking about it, Marcus," Mr. Delgado said, with a knowing smile. "I can see it in your work. You're not just here to get by anymore. You're here to succeed." The counselor's belief in him struck a chord deep inside. Marcus couldn't deny it any longer. He wanted this. He wanted to prove that he could make something of himself, not just for the family, but for himself. And so, Marcus took the leap. He put in the work. Late nights after the farm, early mornings before school, using every ounce of strength he had to balance it all. His teachers took notice of his efforts. His classmates saw the changes, and slowly, Marcus's reputation shifted. He wasn't just the quiet kid on the farm anymore. He was someone who would succeed. One day, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his mother came in, a letter in her hand. It was postmarked from a town in Georgia he hadn't seen in years. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the familiar handwriting, the one he'd spent so much time trying to forget. "I didn't think he'd ever write," Sarah said quietly, sitting beside him. "But here it is." Marcus held the letter in his hands for a long moment, unsure whether to open it. When he finally did, the words on the page were heavy, the ink faded from years of travel. His father explained his abandonment in the simplest terms he could muster. The mistakes, the fear, the selfishness that led him to leave. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't expect Marcus to understand. But there was one line that hit Marcus harder than anything else. "I'm sorry, son. I couldn't be the father you needed, but I hope you become the man you were always meant to be." Marcus read it twice, then with a sigh, he set the letter down. For a moment, the silence in the room seemed to grow louder, like an echo of all the years that had passed, but then Marcus realized something. He had needed no forgiveness, no closure from his father. The man he had become was not defined by the absence of his father, but by his own strength, his own choices. "I don't need this to move forward," Marcus said, his voice steady, his hands firm. "I'm not the same boy who needed his father's approval. I'm who I need to be, and that's enough." Sarah put her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and gentle, a small smile playing on her lips. "When did you grow up so fast?" Marcus looked at her, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. "I just want to help. Not because I have to, but because I can." That night, when Marcus returned to the farm, something inside him felt lighter. The letter had given him closure, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't the answers that mattered. It was the realization that he had been enough all along. A few weeks later, the day came when Marcus earned his first official paycheck. It was a small sum, but to him it felt like everything. He walked into the house, the envelope in his hand, and found his family gathered around the table. Sarah busy with bills as usual, Tommy and Lisa playing in the corner. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with pride, "this is for you. It's not much, but I want to help with the bills." Sarah looked at him, her eyes soft with surprise and gratitude. "Marcus, you don't have to—" "I want to," he interrupted gently, handing her the money. "You've worked hard enough. It's my turn now." But there was more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another item. Something he had promised Tommy a long time ago. A brand new baseball glove. It was nothing fancy, just a simple glove, but to Tommy, it was everything. "Here," Marcus said, holding the glove out to his younger brother. "I know I said I'd teach you baseball. Now I can. We can learn together." Tommy's face lit up, his eyes wide with joy. "Really? Thanks, Marcus." He hugged the glove to his chest, bouncing on his feet in excitement. Sarah watched the exchange, a mix of emotions flooding her. She had always been proud of Marcus, but seeing him take on this responsibility, this care for his siblings, filled her with maybe something deeper, a pride she hadn't known she could feel. Marcus smiled as he watched Tommy run around the room, pretending to throw a pitch, laughing as he practiced with his new glove. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was fulfilling the promise he had made, like he was giving Tommy a life he never had. As the day wore on and the family gathered around the table for dinner, Marcus sat back and allowed himself to breathe, to take in the reality of the life he was building. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was his. He had worked for it, and he had earned it. And as he looked at his mother, his siblings, he realized that he had found something far greater than success or closure. He had found his place in the world, not defined by the absence of his father or the struggles of the past, but by the strength he had built inside himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, growing, and becoming the man he was always meant to be. The road ahead would still be long, filled with challenges he could never anticipate. But Marcus was ready. He knew now that the strength to face whatever came next wasn't found in the past, but in the choices he made today. Marcus stood in the dim light of the farm's workshop, his hands covered in grease, his mind sharp and focused. The steady hum of the machines around him felt like music to his ears. The old shop had once been just a place to fix broken parts, a utilitarian space in a world of constant work. But now it was something more. It was his. The workshop wasn't just where he spent his days repairing tractors and harvesters. It was where he had built his future, piece by piece. Pete had become more than just a mentor. He was a partner now, teaching Marcus not only the advanced mechanical skills that had once seemed out of reach, but also the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to trust his own hands, his own judgment. Pete had been the first to see Marcus's potential, to believe in him when others hadn't. And now Pete looked at Marcus with the same respect he had once reserved for himself. "You've come a long way, kid," Pete said one afternoon, his voice rough with pride as he watched Marcus adjust the engine of the old combine harvester. "Wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. You're running this shop now, not me." Marcus smiled, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. The days had grown long, but the satisfaction of work well done had never felt better. He had earned every moment, every skill, every piece of knowledge that now made him one of the most trusted mechanics on the farm. But it wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about balance. School, work, family. They were no longer competing forces in his life. Marcus had found a way to juggle it all, even with the weight of responsibilities that still pressed down on him. His grades were improving, his relationships with his teachers stronger. He was no longer the quiet, distant boy who only cared about surviving. He was thriving. At home, Sarah had stopped worrying as much. She still worked long hours, but there was a calm in her now, a peace that came from knowing Marcus was strong and capable. Tommy and Lisa flourished, their futures brighter with each passing day thanks to the stability Marcus had helped bring into their lives. And Tommy was finally learning how to play baseball, just like Marcus had promised. The two of them spent their weekends throwing pitches in the backyard, laughing as they fumbled through the basics, growing together in a way Marcus never thought possible. But there was something else that had changed inside him, something deeper than the skills he had acquired or the respect he had earned. It was the way he saw himself. He had once lived in the shadow of his father's absence, searching for answers, for approval. But as the weeks passed, Marcus realized that his identity wasn't just defined by the man who had abandoned him. It was defined by the man he had become. One evening, as Marcus cleaned up in the workshop, his eyes fell on a photo that had been placed in a simple frame. It was a picture of him, young and determined, crouched next to the harvester during the repair that had changed everything. He had repaired that machine, saved the harvest, and proven to himself that he was more than capable of taking care of his family. And beside the photo was a letter, his father's letter, the one he had once feared to read, the one that had offered no real answers, only words of regret. Marcus had framed it. He hadn't done it out of anger or a desire for closure, but out of acceptance. His father's words were part of his story, but they were no longer the story. Marcus had built his own narrative. He was no longer his father's son. He was Marcus, strong, capable, and whole in his own right. He took a moment to sit in front of the frame, the soft light of the workshop flickering on the photo and the letter. The road he had traveled had been long and difficult, but every piece had led him here. He had learned that strength wasn't just about carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Strength, Marcus realized, was about knowing when to keep going and when to let others help. It was about perseverance, about resilience, and most of all, about understanding that sometimes the greatest strength lies in allowing yourself to be vulnerable. With a deep breath, he stood up, walked over to the photo, and ran his fingers over the glass. He had come a long way from the scared boy who had first stepped into that workshop, unsure of his place in the world. And now, as he looked at his reflection in the glass, he knew that he had created a future that was his to shape. Maybe strength isn't about carrying everything, Marcus said quietly to himself, his voice steady. Maybe it's about knowing when to accept help and keep trying. The words hung in the air, not just as a lesson he had learned, but as a truth he had come to embrace. He wasn't alone anymore. Not in the workshop, not in his family, and not in his heart. He had built something lasting, something real. And as the sun began to set behind the farm, casting long shadows across the fields, Marcus stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He could see the future stretching out before him, a path that was no longer clouded by uncertainty. The world was his now, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt ready to face it.